This presentation is being brought to you by the Tipton Auto Group, Brownsville's oldest continually operating automobile dealership.
In this particular episode, we're going to start with the end. You can't get any more finite than the cemetery for an end. The story of J.G. Fernandez began in 1876, a monumental time for the Fernandez family. But they had no idea that they had given birth to a baby boy that would grow up to be a financial titan in South Texas. Yes, he was the controller during his period of professional banking involvement of the largest and most complex banking system that existed south of San Antonio at the time. Now, the point that is to be made here at this moment is that you had a man that had suffered adversity during the period from 1911, actually 1914 and 1915. And it's all around here in this cemetery. And yet he went on in spite of the huge adversities that he was subjected to. He went on to accomplish incredible feats in his lifetime. Let me point out a couple of things, and I'll get to the details later. J.G. Fernandez died in 1939. Okay. His wife, Elizabeth McGarry Fernandez. Mr. McGarry was one of the officers in one of his banks, and that was carried on. Then you have 1914, and it's very touching. Baby Fernandez was to be his little girl. On this monument it says, "She came and went on St. Valentine's Day, 1914. So you had a foundation in that particular year, but it gets worse. Juanito, his namesake, his little 7-year-old son, and the namesake of his brother Miguel died on the same day, likely in each other's arms. They were under the watchful eye of his wife, Aunt Bess. I call her Aunt Bess because these were relatives of mine. Bess did not pay attention on that day, and those two little boys drowned on the river where they were swimming. Bess committed suicide later on in that same year, and I can see why. So can you imagine what this man had going through his mind, and yet he had to continue on with his businesses, his goals, and whatever, in spite of all this. In 1914, his little girl died. That was when he made a pact to actually start the State National Bank that he had just founded, and he'd already organized the Merchants National Bank in 1903. And he built a fine 4-story building at the corner of 11th and Elizabeth in 1911. But here he is in 1914. And he made a pact with the Brownsville Bank and Trust, a very, very respected firm, to combine his bank with theirs and make a conglomerate that was going to go into banking history in a huge way. So 1911, 1914, 1915, 1939. He came from there and arrived here. This is J.G. Fernandez's story. Well, that trip to the cemetery was necessary in the whole scheme of things in order to really relay what J.G. Fernandez was about, what his backbone, his constitution was, because I couldn't have done it. Looking at those tragedies that were mentioned in the cemetery tour, can you imagine? It's just, who would want to go onwards? But he did. He went onwards in a big way. Let me explain a little bit about, in particular, the drowning of his son and of his brother's son. Those are the two namesakes of the family. You have Juanito, which was John. It was John G. Jr. Fernandez, that was his son. And then you had the namesake of Miguel, his brother, his brother's son. And Aunt Bess was on the river with them. In those days, you didn't have Dean Porter Park. You didn't have all of these other parks, that conventional-looking parks that we have nowadays. And so a lot of people really went down to the river in order to swim, picnic, and that type of thing. The resakas in Brownsville weren't developed in those days. They were just bogs to speak of. And a prime example of a real bog, a problematic bog, was the Rio Viejo, St. Joe, resaca that goes along there. So you wouldn't go picnicking in an area like that. So Aunt Bess went down with the two boys, and they were going to go out for a summer afternoon, and then the little boys were swimming and whatever. Well, but Aunt Bess had a problem. She was on pills and that type of thing. And in those days, you didn't have the regulations in pharmacology like you have nowadays. And so she was out of it. The family kept telling JG, they said, please do something about her, send her off and have her treatment or whatever. Because, well, the social scene in Brownsville was very guarded, and our family had a particular, as stilted as it may sound, a particular image to uphold, and Aunt Bess wasn't doing it. So sure enough, they were there on the river, and the boys got into trouble in a current or whatever, and there was a smuggler on the river that tried to come in and to offer assistance, to offer aid, and Aunt Bess fought him off. I don't know where her mind was, but she fought him off, and the little boys died. They both drowned. So then she came directly to my Uncle Miguel's house, and see, Rosalie was busy having children forever. They had 17 children, if you can imagine. So, if you didn't find her in the bed, nursing the child or recovering or whatever, it was an odd moment. But anyway, in that particular afternoon in 1915, Aunt Bess came through and she says, well, go ahead and shoot me. And Aunt Rosalie said, why? She says, well, I've just drowned our two sons. And very stoically, Aunt Rosalie looked into the space of the skies and said, well, if it's God's will, we have to accept it. How could she say that? I mean, I would have hit the ceiling. If it's God's will, you must accept it. Of course, she had 16 more children as backup, but nonetheless, it was it goes to show you what her constitution was all about. But in going beyond that, in the circle of the three boys that became what we would call the triumvirate of the Miguel Fernandez branch. They are an interesting group because, of course, the oldest was Miguel Fernandez. And then you had Uncle Albert, and then you had Uncle JG. And they were all dynamic. They were very well educated, and they just really handled a vast lands of cattle and crops and banks and the whole 9 yards. They just really were quite accomplished people. And if you think about it, the amount of what they had in their blood was carried over. You had the huge producer, which was Jose Fernandez. That one just set the tone for everything else. And then, of course, you had the grouping there of Miguel, JG, and Albert coming through. And actually, the family thought about this, and they really were looking at the two boys there, the namesakes, as being the continuance of the family. And they knew that they not only had the genes, they had the spirit, and God only knows what they would have accomplished. But that's there's no need in really chatting over that. It's gone. All right, let's get back to Uncle JG's early years, and when he was growing up. Yeah, he received a very, very guarded social life and a really good education. And then when he got up to the age of about 18, actually he went away for finishing school, at a particular point, and then got, and those days you didn't have 4-year degree programs with college. You just went to a finishing school, and then you got the basics from St. Mary's or wherever else. We didn't have the colleges here where we had to send our family away, whether it be St. Joseph's College in Bardstown, Kentucky, which a lot of them went to, by the way, or to San Antonio, which would be the hub of education there. But anyway, 18, he was ready to get into the world. And he made the comment to somebody from the family. He says, I really want to get into banking. And then he went out on the streets and he asked, the First National Bank was the premier bank at the time. They were founded in like 1891. And he went up to him and asked for a job. And they laughed at him. They said, no, you don't know anything. 18, you want to be a banker. Just come back to us when you have some experience. It was rather, adroit of them to have come back in that manner. But anyway, he got his feelings hurt. And he went to his father, Miguel. Miguel, by that time, his father, the brother to my great-grandfather, the original ones that came over from Spain. And he says, they're right in a particular degree. You don't have the background, but we can do that. If you're willing to go through a particular tutelage, a training period. I've got an old friend of mine, This was Ike Pryor. Ike Pryor was the leading cattleman of Texas. He was in those years, and we're looking at 1898 in that region when Uncle J.G. was ready to get out in the world, and Ike had a bank in Columbus, Texas, that was just tremendous. It was a cattleman's bank, and so. Miguel, J.G.'s father, says, we're going to send you up there for a particular training period, and with Ike and the old man Ike Pryor. And so he did so. Now, I see an account that mentioned that he went up for 8 years. He was in that training. Well, that's rather, gets up there in the years that he was away from here. But nonetheless, he came back. He came back in the region of 2002, going on into 2003. And he was ready by that time. And guess who he had in tow? Ike Pryor. Uncle J.G. must have been very, very dynamic. For him to have gathered the people by his side, the qualified people that really believed in him, that joined him in his efforts. And they said, come with me. Okay, sure, J.G., let's go. And so anyway, he had Ike Pryor, and he made Ike, Mr. Pryor, a board member of the bank that he formed. Now, where was that bank? That is a really trick question for somebody that just doesn't know the background features in our photographs in Brownsville. Why do you say that? Well, you always look at the old photographs and you say, oh, well, that's the Brown family, or that's the Kowalskis or whatever. No. If you look in the background, you can see buildings. And in time, in your research, you're going to find out what those buildings are. And of course, those buildings are long since demolished. So the newspaper articles coming through from the turn of the century on up, they're really, really vague. They don't say, well, okay, because we really didn't use house numbers at that time, street numbers. We didn't. We said it's the State National Bank, and people knew that's where it was, or the Puente building, or the Mireles building. Buildings came into prominence in this picture for a good reason. All right, now we got to go back to the time of the founding of Brownsville, 1850. There was a building that was built, of course, my uncle Jose San Roman built an 1850 building, which is real early in the solid structures of downtown Brownsville. But there at the corner of 12th and Elizabeth. If anybody knows the old Hargroves building, well, it was right across the street from it. And there on the other side of the street, on what you'd call the west side of it, because Elizabeth Street ran what we would call north and south going towards Fort Brown. Well, directly on that corner, which would be on the east side, there was a building that was erected by an old gentleman, and there are newspaper articles actually bring out a mention. One of them, which is erroneous, it says the Galveston Planters Bank. Well, I don't know. There again, the details, the history of all of the buildings and the interactions, the formation, the downfall, and the rising of all of these businesses in early Brownsville is rather sketchy. So it could have been the Galveston Planters Bank, because that grouping did exist. But there is evidence that there was an old man there by the name of Reynolds. And that was called, when you get up into the turn of the century, where we are now with JG, that was called the old banking corner. I guess it was already 50 years old and long gone by that time. But there was a building there that was the Celaya building. It was bought in 1895 by Simon Celaya, and that was the head of the Rio Grande Railroad. Okay? But a real trick question is, if you look at earlier photographs, if you look at the facade right now, you look up on the second floor, and there are 6 windows up there. That's how broad the bank was. It was a full 50 feet of frontage. And then, but you look at the older photographs during the time that it was the Galveston Planters Bank, or a spin-off thereof, a similar bank, real early in Brownsville's formation, 1850. The photographs then only had 3 windows, because it wasn't a broad structure. That was it. And evidently, at the time that Simon Celaya bought it, he expanded it on over into the full 50 feet. Okay, but if we go back to that period of 1895, coming on up, then it was that building in an interim period of 1902 that JG actually had a portion of what we call the Celaya Rio Grande Railroad building. And that's where his first bank was. That was in 1902. Then he built the other bank that is now where we call C&L Drugs on the corner there. The references are to the old Miralles grocery building, and it's a 2-story building. In fact, in another one of the old photographs in the background, you can see a 2-story building there, and then you see the federal building that was replaced by our courthouse and then City Hall. But that was the Miralles grocery at that time. And then across the street from it was this is getting rather complex, but it shows you the positioning of all these banks. Where the Az's building was there on 11th and Elizabeth, there was indeed the first National Bank. And that was 1891. And that was a long affair. And then in about 1915, they moved diagonally across the street where the columns were, where the Pan American Bank was, and all of that. And that was the First National Bank of Brownsville, or at Brownsville, or whatever, that went defunct. But you see how all these movements took place. Well, the one we're going to point to is the one that the movements. Here you have JG starting up his little rudimentary bank in the old banking building with the Celaya Rio Grande Railroad building there. And then there was a very well-respected bank directly across the street there, across from Crechel's saloon on the corner of 12th and Elizabeth, and it was called the Brownsville, what the devil was it called? It was called the Brownsville State Bank or something like that. Okay, and it was headed by Ashheim, and then it had some very premier people as their officers. You had E.K. Goodrich, and I believe you had you had Emilio Forto, and all of that level of people of Brownsville that were very, very highly respected in that bank. Well, Uncle J.G. moved on over and made an offer to Ashheim to combine the two banks. But actually what he did was he absorbed the Brownsville State Bank, and they made the whole conglomerate into the State National Bank. Okay? And that was the start of the whole affair. We're going to get back to the bank that was over there on 11th Street, because that is the subject of this particular podcast. That is the Merchants National Bank. But I just wanted to show you the underpinnings of how Uncle JG went through and never slept a moment in making his networking done. And then that was the foundation of his next bank, which was State National. All right, let's get back to him and his endeavors there with the Merchants National Bank. Yes, they demolished that building, the Miralles grocery store, in 1911. It was a two-story affair, brick building, goes back to probably just time after the Civil War. And then he built his four-story building, which was the current building that it's there on the corner of 11th and Elizabeth, and it became the Merchants State Bank and then the Merchants National Bank, because you've got to apply for charters, whether it's under state rule or national rule. And he was there for that length of time. John Gregg was a key figure as a director, as a president, because they switched around directors and presidents at multiple times through their existence. And the CEO of that Merchants Bank, effectively, for all the times, was J.G. Fernandez. The president shifted. It was James McAllen. It was John McAllen. And then it was John Gregg. And then it was J.B. Scott, which was another reverend figure in the banking industry at the time. And so they kind of like shifted positions over the years there. Well, J.G., like I say, he made that Merchants Bank the leading bank until 1921, when the State National Bank came out of the ground with a 5-story building. And then, of course, that was the capital bank of all South Texas, everything south of San Antonio. This was the banking center that one went to and referred to and did business with. The Merchants National had, as I say, 4 stories beyond the ground floor, which was the banking institution, the lobby and the tellers and the vault and all of that. Well, there were 3 more stories up there, and those were the businesses that one wanted to have their office in. You had the old doctors that were in town at the time, whether it be Dr. Thorne or Dr. Works or whatever, before he did his sanatorium. They had offices in that, and then you had the steamship companies in the planning of the future port. They had them there. So you were positioned in a premier location if you had your office in the Merchants National Bank. And it was quite prestigious to have an address in that bank. The stages, as I had mentioned leading up to this, that the Merchants National Bank was secondary in J.G.'s activities. It's hard to conceive how you could have 2 premier banks at the same time, and he was CEO of both banks simultaneously. But anyway, the activities of juggling those 2 banks at the same time, goes to show you what kind of strength the person had. And then there was an era. We're coming up to the time of the fall of the market, 1929. And there was a scandal that appeared. That scandal involved the bank officer that J.G. placed as his president for Merchants, and that was John Gregg. He came out of Sherman, Texas, or one of those central Texas locations, and he was the bank president during the time of the 29. Now you got to bear in mind, when the bank examiners came in, when the stock market fell in 29, that took us all by surprise, because we overextended ourselves. We'd never been through a thing like that before, and the economists at the time really didn't have an example as to say, okay, hey, look, we didn't have the Fed or that type of a thing in order to say, look, you got to pull back. You can't just go out there rampantly and extend your credit and all of that. You don't have a foundation, and the banks have to keep by their charter and their agreement as a federal bank or a state bank. You have to keep a certain amount of your deposits in reserve. I don't care if you're going through and you're making mortgages and the interest rates coming in and you got a good cash flow. There is a set figure as to how much you need to have in your vaults there, because otherwise what happened will be what did happen. The bank examiners came in whammo at the time there after 29, and the only bank that had a balanced vault was the State National Bank. That was the only one that survived in the Great Depression. Let's get back to John Gregg. Well, it was embarrassing because we all knew him, and I heard the little murmurs from my old lady friends. Oh, they arrested John Gregg and he went off to prison, and all this because you had Scott that was there at the same time. You had R.B. Krieger, who was a tremendous figure, and they escaped by the hair on their chinny chin. And then the families all looked at that and they said, oh, poor John Gregg, he went off to prison. And that was the case because his deposits did not match what his quota was required to be. And it set back all the banks of the valley, well, of the nation. But I mean, we're in our little microcosm down here of the valley. And you had the Bank of Alamo, you had the Bank of McAllen, you had the Bank of San Juan. All of these little boroughs had their banks, and they all were either put on a suspension or an outright closure, and they were under a strict governance of the government until things got right. There were a lot of closures. It was a very unfortunate time. A lot of people went bankrupt, and a lot of dreams and desires were just washed away by the Great Depression. And unfortunately, in 33, going on into 34, that's when the examiners got Mr. Gregg. And I think that the Merchants National Bank folded in 1935. And when I say folded, they closed the doors. Several notices appeared in the papers from time to time from 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. And all right, we're renegotiating and whatever and all that. It just didn't work. So by 35, that was an empty lobby. And the notice appeared in the papers by sheriff's order, sell the assets. And the great Merchants National Bank was no longer. So what was there? Well, there was an empty lobby, and then the progression of communications in the papers at the time said at one time, shortly after that, 36, 37, there was a furniture company there, and then there were other little businesses because it was prime real estate. Even though business was slow, it was stunted because of the economic condition. That was still the place in town geographically for your prime business. And then the salvation came getting off into the 40s. With the recovery that we had during the war effort, then how did it come about? Well, it was John Young who was the receiver. Amazing. I don't know how that came about. I guess he was the main financier of the physical works of the Merchants National Bank after J.G. sold his stock. He must have sold it to John Young. So there were certain offers that came about, and I think there was an offer. I do know there was an offer for $15,000. $15,000 for that entire four-story building at that time, and that's when John Young says, no, I want $17,500 for it. Well, he regretted it because when the people came through in order to put a drugstore, and that's what bailed him out, in the facility in about 1940. Well, then that particular sale took place to a Harlingen group, and I think that the building sold for $12,002 or something like that. You see, so then they put Brooks Central Walgreens Pharmacy in there, and that lasted on up into the 50s. And it was a thriving concern. By that time, downtown Brownsville had pretty well built back, and then you had the entry of Majestic Theater, Zales, J.C. Penney's, and all of those businesses. So it was fleshed out. And then Brooks was going along, and then they sold out to a group out of Harlingen again, and that was Paul Caruth. He was a realtor, and a Charlie Little. And what did they do? Another pharmacy. But at that time, that was what was the name of that one? It was and at that time it was called Central Walgreens Pharmacy. But it was odd because and going back into a recognizable figure who was employed by them as a pharmacist. He was straight out of pharmacy school. Was George Samano. He was a pharmacist there with your Caruth as your Walgreens. Well, then what happened was the Samanos came into their gas and oil money from Starr County, from their ranch up there, and then Samanos spun off and built another Walgreens in Brownsville. I find that rather odd that and they were a block apart, you know. But anyway, that was his, and that one, Samano, of course, moved over. And then the two Walgreens were operating simultaneously, both very, very successful. The one thing that was so much of a tradition with the Caruth building there was the lunch counter, the Walgreens booths and the little stools on all of that. So, but both of them were very, very successful, going into 50s, the 60s, the 70s. And I think Samano held on. Samano held on to his Walgreens there until off into the 80s. But now in 1975, we're still focusing on this beautiful building that Uncle J.G. built. That building in the dark of the night heard the screaming of fire engines. Yes, it was on fire, totally on fire. In 75, and the entire interior burnt, leaving just the shell of this classic structure, because that structure was a composite structure of marble and marble chips as your poured lintel pieces and all of that, and it just literally gutted the building, and Paul Caruth was just devastated. He just said, "Oh my goodness," because all of he'd put many years into the development of that business, and it was a fond spot in everybody's heart, his Walgreens agency there. So what did he do? He says, "Well, I'm going to put some iron beams on the inside. I'm going to leave the shell of the outside as is, and then build it back up." And that's what he did. He built the entire interior around that existing shell, and that's what's there today. He got out of the business, into the 80s, and then it went on the market as a general retail outlet, and the ground floor is as such today. But it had such a glorious past, such a beautiful past, and the center point of people's mercantile allegiance was right there on the corner of 11th and Elizabeth. Uncle J.G. lived a life that was fuller than normal. Not long after he sold his interest in his banking empire and bought the 6,000 plus acres of Rancho Viejo, he was looking forward to doing something that the Fernandez clan viewed as somewhat impossible: throwing away his neckties and beginning a gentleman's planter's existence. Let me explain about the neckties. So we really didn't know our uncles Miguel, J.G., and Albert without their neckties. We thought that they slept with them. So for him to go into retirement is like, just a total change of destiny for him, all the formality that he'd been accustomed to all his life. Local newspapers were happy at his arrival at that moment, praising him for finally taking a rest. Then on a crisp Friday, February day, he walked the 4 blocks from his advisory post at the bank that he had just sold to have lunch at his home on 8th and East Elizabeth. As he sat down at the dinner table to enjoy the soup that his housekeeper had prepared for him, he folded his napkin, turned to her, and he said, "I'm so hungry I could die." And he did. Not too many years ago, my uncle Louis Fernandez, and that was JG's nephew, he was about 90 at the time, Uncle Louis, relayed to me a story that a local newspaper published as a headline the following day after JG's death that read, "Brownsville's richest man dies of hunger." And of course, he referred back to that little happening incident. I never came across that publication, but I know that he was greatly missed. And a great many people were feeling his loss for his industriousness, his dauntless dedication to his hometown, and his love of family, and for countless acts of charity. We found out about many things throughout the years that never hit the press or in open conversation, but he just did them to help people. Now let's take a look at the circle of professionals that JG surrounded himself with. Emmett Goodrich, Ike Pryor, John McAllen, R.B. Krieger, Oscar Suter, the Eschheims, J.B. Scott. All of these people were actually drawn to him. And these were magnanimous individuals in the banking circles of South Texas at that time. But it was a very creative bunch, and they all went down into banking history as true developers of the science of banking.